If you would like to read some of my other stories, go to authorthomasmiller.com, where you can read all my stories free of charge. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful day.
The Twisted Mind of Igor Sorman by the Mind of Thomas Miller. Igor Sorman lived in a run-down shack in the middle of Tennessee. He was a strange fella, with wild hair and a crooked smile. His only companion was his trusty chainsaw, which he affectionately referred to as Leatherface. Igor had a peculiar obsession with the infamous horror movie character, and he spent most of his days watching and reenacting scenes from the films. As a child, Igor was always an outcast. He was odd and awkward, with a morbid fascination for all things macabre. His classmates avoided him, and the adults in his small town whispered behind his back. But Igor didn't mind. He found solace in his own company and his chainsaw. He spent hours in the woods, chopping down trees and pretending to be the terrifying villain from his favorite movies. As he got older, Igor became more and more fixated on becoming a chainsaw killer himself. He dreamed of one day wielding his trusty Leatherface and terrorizing the town, just like in the movies. But no matter how hard he tried, he could never quite live up to his hero's image. He was clumsy and uncoordinated, often injuring himself while attempting to wield the heavy tool. As a result, Igor was rejected by society and had no real friends or family. No woman ever showed any interest in him, and he spent most of his days alone in his shack, surrounded by posters and memorabilia of his favorite horror movies. But Igor didn't mind. He had Leatherface, and that was all he needed. One night, Igor's mind snapped. He had been planning for years to become a chainsaw killer, and he knew that the time had come. He had heard about a group of young teenagers who were planning to go to a theme park down the road in Saw Creek, Tennessee. Igor saw this as the perfect opportunity to fulfill his twisted desires. He waited until nightfall and then set out towards the theme park, carrying Leatherface in one hand and a rope in the other. He had constructed a makeshift mask using an old leather jacket, and he felt invincible as he made his way through the dark and deserted streets. When he arrived at the theme park, he quickly found the group of teenagers he had been following. They were laughing and joking, completely unaware of the danger that lurked nearby. Igor watched them for a few moments, his heart racing with excitement. This was it. This was his moment. With a maniacal grin on his face, Igor charged towards the group, revving his chainsaw and yelling at the top of his lungs. The teenagers screamed and scattered, but Igor was relentless. He chased them through the park, swinging his chainsaw wildly and laughing merrily. The group of teenagers, now terrified and disoriented, ran in different directions, trying to find a way out of the park. But Igor was everywhere, taunting and chasing them. Eventually, they all ended up in a dark and abandoned section of the park, surrounded by old carnival rides and dilapidated buildings. Igor had the group cornered, and he reveled in their fear. This was his moment to shine, his chance to be the chainsaw killer he had always dreamed of. He lunged towards the group, ready to strike with Leatherface, when suddenly a bright light shone in his face. It was the police. They had been alerted by the screams and had quickly made their way to the theme park. They had Igor surrounded, with their guns pointed at him. Igor's heart sank as he realized that his plan had been foiled. The teenagers were safe, but they were also traumatized by the experience. They had never witnessed anything so disturbing and terrifying in their lives. Igor was taken away by the police, still clutching his chainsaw, and was later declared mentally unstable. The events of that night shook the small town of Saw Creek, Tennessee, and the legend of Igor Sorman and his chainsaw would forever be a haunting memory for those who had experienced it. As for Igor, he spent the rest of his days in a mental institution, still dreaming of his glory days as a chainsaw killer. But for the residents of Saw Creek, his name would always be whispered in fear and horror, a reminder of the dark and twisted side of human nature.
And She Wasn't Alone. Live Burn of Ashes. By Thomas Miller. The thick, acrid stench of formaldehyde lingered in the still air of the mortuary, a place where the dead rested in limbo before their final descent into ash. The mortuary was an old one, its faded bricks moss-covered, and the wooden floorboards creaked underfoot with a groan of age and weight of countless lifeless bodies that had passed through its cold, grey halls. Marcus Holwell was no stranger to death. He had worked the night shift for nearly 2 decades, his hands numb from the touch of cold flesh, his heart long hardened to the cries of grieving families. But tonight was different. The body lay on the metal slab, draped in a thin white sheet that did little to mask the shape of the woman beneath it. Her name, Evangeline Carr, was etched on the tag tied to her toe. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. She had been found alone in her dilapidated apartment, lifeless. Another forgotten soul in a world too quick to discard the living. Marcus slid his gloved hand under the sheet, uncovering the pale, greyish skin of the cadaver. The woman's face was sunken, her lips a soft blue, eyes closed in that eternal, dreamless sleep. He sighed, the routine of it all washing over him like a familiar tide. With practiced hands, he prepared the body for the furnace, the large steel chamber that would soon consume her in flames. A cold and silent end to an equally cold life. The mortuary was quiet, save for the faint hum of the furnace warming up, the fire within waiting to devour the flesh. Marcus reached for the gurney to wheel her toward the chamber when something caught his attention, a flicker, a shadow of movement beneath the sheet. His breath hitched, heart thudding in his chest. He stared, frozen, waiting for another sign. A faint gasp, a soft, pitiful rasp came from the body. His heart pounded louder. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But then, the impossible happened. The sheet stirred again, a faint twitch in her fingers, and her chest, barely noticeable, rose with the shallowest of breaths. "Dear God," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling as panic gripped him. His gloved hands scrambled to pull the sheet back, fully exposing the body. Her lips quivered, her eyes fluttered open, dull and glassy, as if waking from a long nightmare. Evangeline Carr was alive. The blood drained from Marcus's face, his mind unable to comprehend what was happening. No heartbeat, no pulse, she had been declared dead. Yet here she was, breathing. Alive in the cold grasp of death. Frantically, he grabbed his phone, dialing for an ambulance with trembling fingers. His voice was a whisper when the operator answered, urgency choking his words. I have a body. A woman. She was declared dead, but she's alive. She's breathing." As he waited for help, Marcus knelt beside the gurney, placing his hand gently on her chest. Her heartbeat was faint, erratic, like the sputtering of an engine long gone cold. He could feel her slipping, life dangling by a fraying thread. There was no time. The fire of the furnace roared louder, mocking him with the sound of impending doom. "Stay with me," he whispered, eyes wild with desperation. "Please, stay with me." Evangeline's lips parted, a single word escaping in a breathless rasp, "cold." He grabbed the closest blanket, draping it over her frail, shivering form, but he knew deep down it wouldn't be enough. Her body had been left in the cold for too long, her mind lost in a purgatory between life and death. The minutes stretched into eternity, and Marcus fought with all his might to keep her tethered to the world of the living. He massaged her chest, willing her heart to beat stronger, faster. But her breaths grew weaker, fainter, until they were barely more than a whisper in the quiet room. Her eyes found his, glassy and distant. A soft sigh left her lips, and with it, whatever fragile hold she had on life. Her body went limp, the final breath escaping like the last puff of smoke from a dying flame. Marcus sat back, staring at her, the helplessness crashing over him like a cold wave. He had tried. He had fought for her, for that last shred of life. But it was too late. The furnace rumbled in the background, indifferent and constant. The door to the mortuary burst open as the paramedics arrived, their hurried footsteps echoing through the chamber. But Marcus already knew. There was nothing left to save. They checked her pulse, confirmed the obvious, and covered her once more with the sheet. The same body that had moved, breathed, and whispered moments before now lay still, cold and silent as the dead should be. Marcus stood there, his mind reeling. He felt numb, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had seen many bodies in his time, cremated countless souls, but never had he been so close to something so morbid, so strange, as life clinging to death's doorstep. As the paramedics left, Marcus turned back toward the furnace, its doors wide open, flames licking the metal grate inside. He placed his hand on the gurney's cold steel, then slowly wheeled Evangeline Carr toward her final destination. The fire, as it always did, would claim her. The dead do not stay alive for long. The flicker of flames inside the furnace cast eerie shadows across the mortuary walls, dancing with a grotesque life of their own. Marcus felt their warmth reach out, contrasting with the icy chill that clung to his skin, a reminder of how close he had been to pulling someone back from the abyss. As the steel gurney clanked toward the mouth of the inferno, he hesitated, his fingers tightening on the handle. Evangeline's face, so recently alive, haunted him. The way her lips had parted, the way her eyes, glass as they were, had looked at him, pleading, desperate. What had she been thinking in those final moments? Had she known she was coming back, only to die again? He could still hear her breath, that single rasping plea, cold. A shiver ran down his spine. No matter how many bodies he burned, no matter how many times he watched the dead dissolve into embers, this would stay with him. It was wrong. So terribly wrong. But the furnace was relentless, its steady hum pulling him forward. The flames crackled louder now, hungry, as if they knew the flesh they would soon devour. And yet, Marcus couldn't bring himself to move. What if? The thought twisted his gut into knots. What if she hadn't been alone in death? What if there were more like her, slipping between life and the finality of the grave, only to wake in terror? What if he had been cremating the living for years? He slammed the brakes on the gurney, stepping back as if repelled by the thought. A bitter bile rose in his throat, the room spinning. The mortuary felt claustrophobic now, its grey walls pressing in on him like a tomb. The furnace roared again, a demanding, insistent cry. Do your duty. Burn the dead. The rational part of his mind screamed at him, telling him there was no mistake. She had been checked. Pronounced dead. Her body had shown all the signs, rigor mortis, pallor, coldness. But the erratic flicker of life in her had shattered that certainty. It had brought doubt into the one place Marcus had always found solace, the cold, predictable finality of death. He found himself trembling, hands gripping the edge of the furnace's door, the heat searing against his face. He looked at the gurney one last time, at the sheet that covered Evangeline's body, as though it could protect her from what was to come. No more hesitation. With a deep breath, Marcus pushed the gurney forward, into the belly of the furnace. The metal tray slid in, her form disappearing from view. He stepped back, his heart pounding, throat dry as he pulled the lever. The door shut with a heavy clang, sealing her fate. The fire roared to life inside the chamber, consuming the body within, turning flesh to ash in mere moments. The sound of crackling bones, of soft tissue melting away, echoed in the silence. Marcus stood there, frozen, staring at the furnace. His mind was a whirl of thoughts, images, and regrets. He had done what he was supposed to do. It was his job, after all. He burned the dead. But the weight of it now felt heavier than it ever had before. Minutes passed. The room grew colder, despite the inferno just feet away. Marcus turned toward his desk, the clipboard with Evangeline Carr's death certificate still lying on top. He stared at her name, the ink smudged from where his shaking hands had gripped it earlier. He thought of her again. Of the flicker of life in her dead body, the fragile heartbeat that had briefly fluttered back to existence. And of how that tiny spark had been extinguished in the flames. The mortuary was silent once more. But Marcus knew that silence would never be the same. Not after this. With slow, deliberate steps, he moved to the furnace's control panel. His finger hovered over the button that would shut off the inferno, turning everything to final embers. Before pressing it, he whispered softly, as if speaking to her ghost, "I'm sorry." The furnace hissed as it cooled, the fire fading into nothingness. But the unease, the feeling of something left unresolved, lingered like smoke. Marcus turned to leave the room, the distant echo of footsteps following him down the corridor. But in the dim light of the mortuary, the shadows seemed to shift, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he could have sworn he heard it again, the faintest rasp of a breath. He paused, heart thudding in his chest, listening intently. But there was nothing now. Just the emptiness. Perhaps it was only his guilt. Perhaps it was something more. As the mortuary doors swung shut behind him, Marcus Howell knew one thing for certain. he would never see death the same way again. And when he returned to the mortuary for his next shift, he would do so haunted by the memory of Evangeline Carr, the woman who had died twice. The fire had taken her body, but her final breath still lingered in the air. And it always would. The next few nights passed in a haze for Marcus. The mortuary seemed darker, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets. Every creak of the old floorboards made him flinch, every flicker of the dim lights felt like a warning, a reminder of what had happened. He kept telling himself it was over, that Evangeline Carr was truly gone now, consumed by the flames, reduced to nothing more than a box of ashes. But the weight of what he'd witnessed, what he'd failed to prevent, gnawed at him. Sleep came sporadically, haunted by nightmares, images of bodies stirring beneath sheets, of faces emerging from the flames, screaming without sound. One evening, after another restless night, Marcus returned to the mortuary, the familiar routine providing a small sense of normalcy. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the unease. His eyes would dart to the furnace, as though expecting to see something, or someone, emerging from its steel door. As he went about his work, logging the incoming bodies and preparing them for cremation, Marcus noticed something strange. The ledger on his desk, where he recorded the names of the deceased, felt heavier than it should. When he flipped to the last entry, the one for Evangeline Carr, his breath caught. The page was blank. Her name, the details of her death, the signature of the attending doctor, everything was gone. It was as though she had never existed. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and flipped through the pages, looking for any sign of her entry. But there was nothing. Only the faint indentation of his handwriting where it had once been. His pulse quickened. Perhaps it was a mistake, an administrative error. But deep down, Marcus knew something was wrong, something more than just paperwork. His hand trembled as he reached for the phone, dialing the hospital where Evangeline had been pronounced dead. After a few rings, a voice answered on the other end, tired and detached, as most night shift workers were. Memorial Hospital, this is Nurse Rhodes. How can I help you? Marcus cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. Hi, this is Marcus Holwell from Holwell and Sons Mortuary. I had a woman a few nights ago, Evangeline Carr. I need to check her records, but I can't seem to find her information here. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of fingers tapping on a keyboard. Evangeline Carr, you said? Hold on one moment. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each second. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Finally, the nurse returned to the line, her voice more hesitant now. I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have any record of a patient by that name. Are you sure you have the correct information? Marcus felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had seen the death certificate, had spoken to the doctor who had declared her dead. She had been here, alive, briefly, but she had been here. There must be a mistake, he insisted, his voice cracking. I cremated her body. There was a death certificate. I'm sorry, sir, but there's no file. No record of Evangeline Carr, the nurse's voice softened, sensing his distress. Maybe you could check with another facility. Marcus hung up, his hand shaking, staring blankly at the phone in his hand. No record. No file. It was as if she had never existed. A sense of dread settled deep in his gut, heavier than anything he had felt before. He stared at the furnace, the place where her body had been reduced to ashes, yet now it seemed as if she had never been there at all. The air in the mortuary grew thick, almost suffocating. Desperate for answers, Marcus checked the cremation log, his last hope of proving that Evangeline had been real. But as he scanned the entries, his heart sank. Her name was missing from the list. Fear gnawed at the edges of his sanity. Could he have imagined it all? Was it possible that the entire encounter had been some bizarre hallucination brought on by years of dealing with death? But it had felt so real, too real to be a figment of his mind. He had to find her ashes. Rushing to the storage room, Marcus unlocked the metal cabinet where they kept the urns of the recently cremated. His hands fumbled through the rows, searching for the urn labeled with her name. But as he reached the shelf where her ashes should have been, he stopped cold. The urn was gone. Panic surged through him. He slammed the cabinet door shut, breathing heavily, his thoughts racing in a disjointed blur. How could her ashes be missing? Where had they gone? He had followed every procedure, made sure everything was done by the book. And yet now, there was no trace of her. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He felt it then, a presence, something watching him. Slowly, he turned around, his eyes scanning the dimly lit mortuary. The shadows seemed darker, more menacing, as if they were alive, shifting just beyond his vision. And then, from the far corner of the room, he heard it. The faintest rasp of a breath. His blood ran cold. It was the same sound he had heard the night Evangeline had come back to life. That weak, desperate gasp for air. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, the sound growing louder, closer. His gaze locked on the far corner where the shadows were thickest. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, fear constricting his throat. The air grew colder, and the sound of breathing stopped. But something else emerged in its place, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Cold, so cold. Marcus stumbled back, his mind reeling. It was her. It had to be her. But how? She was gone, burned, reduced to ash. And yet her voice, so faint and fragile, echoed through the room like a ghost, a reminder of his failure to save her. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving the corner where the voice had come from. The room felt alive with something he couldn't see, something that had crossed over from the other side. As he reached the door, he heard the voice one last time, a whisper that chilled him to his core. "I'm still here." Marcus fled the mortuary, the weight of the darkness pressing down on him like a shroud. He ran through the night, but no matter how far he went, he couldn't escape the truth that followed him. Evangeline Carr had died twice, and somewhere, somehow, she still lingered in the cold. And she wasn't alone.
Just one more walk. From the pen of Thomas Miller. In the quiet suburb of Green Meadows, an elderly man named Harold lived alone in a modest house with his faithful dog, Patches. Patches, a mix of a golden retriever and a beagle, had been Harold's constant companion for 10 years. They were inseparable, sharing their days in a routine of peaceful walks and gentle companionship. Each morning Harold would wake up, put on his old, worn-out hat and take Patches for a stroll around the neighborhood. It was their sacred ritual, a moment of serenity and connection in a world that often seemed too chaotic. But time, as it always does, had been creeping up on Harold. He had been diagnosed with terminal cancer a few months ago, a prognosis that shattered his quiet world. Despite the pain and the growing weakness, Harold held on to his routine with Patches. Every morning, they walked together, Harold's steps slower and more laboured, but Patches always patient and understanding. One chilly autumn morning, as the leaves turned brilliant shades of red and gold, Harold knew deep in his heart that his time was running out. He sat on the edge of his bed, looking at Patches with a heavy heart. Patches, sensing something was wrong, nuzzled his nose against Harold's hand, his eyes filled with concern. "Just one more walk," boy Harold whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "Just one more walk." With great effort, Harold got dressed and managed to put on his hat. Patches wagged his tail, ready for their daily adventure. They walked slowly, Harold leaning heavily on his cane, Patches staying close by his side. They visited all their favourite spots: the old oak tree, the park bench where Harold would sit and watch the world go by, and the little pond where Patches loved to splash around. As they returned home, Harold's strength was nearly gone. He collapsed onto his bed, his breath shallow and laboured. Patches lay beside him, his head resting on Harold's chest, listening to the slowing heartbeat of his beloved owner. That evening Harold passed away peacefully, his hand resting gently on Patches' head. Patches whimpered softly, knowing something had changed forever. The next morning, Animal Control arrived to take Patches away. As they led him out of the house, Patches resisted, looking back at the only home he had ever known, his eyes pleading. "Just one more walk," his eyes seemed to say, as his whimpers echoed through the air. "Just one more walk." But the next day brought a glimmer of hope. Harold's brother James arrived at the house. He had come to collect Patches, fulfilling his promise to his late brother to take care of the loyal dog. When Patches saw James, he wagged his tail hesitantly, sensing a connection. James knelt down and patted Patches' head. "Come on, boy," he said gently. "Let's go home." Patches followed James, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. As they left the house, Patches turned back one last time, his heart aching for Harold. But he knew that Harold would want him to be happy, to continue living the life they had shared. James took Patches to his home, where he was welcomed with open arms. Patches found comfort in the familiar scent of Harold that lingered on James. They formed a new bond, and every day James made sure to take Patches for his walks, just like Harold used to. As the days turned into weeks, Patches found joy again. He missed Harold deeply, but he knew he was loved and cared for. He spent his remaining years with James, walking the same paths he had once walked with Harold, the memories of their time together forever etched in his heart. In the end, Patches had found a new home, a place where he was cherished and loved, and every time he went for a walk with James, he felt a little piece of Harold walking beside him, whispering softly, "Just one more walk, boy. Just one more walk." And so Patches lived out his days, his heart full of the love and memories of a man who had been his whole world. It was a bittersweet ending, but one filled with hope and happiness, a testament to the enduring bond between a man and his dog. Just one more walk. From the pen of Thomas Miller. Forever in his heart, a love story of Thomas and Morgana. Thomas had always been a simple man. He grew up in a small town, and his life had been nothing out of the ordinary. But when he met Morgana, everything changed. Morgana was a beautiful and talented singer, and Thomas fell for her the moment he heard her voice. They quickly became inseparable and soon decided to get married. Their wedding was a grand affair, with family and friends coming from far and wide to celebrate their love. Morgana looked stunning in her white dress, and Thomas felt like the luckiest man in the world. During the reception, Morgana took to the stage to sing a song she had written just for Thomas. As she sang, her voice filled the room with a haunting melody that left everyone spellbound. Thomas watched his bride with pride, his heart bursting with love. But then, in the middle of the song, something went horribly wrong. Morgana's voice faltered, and she clutched at her chest. Thomas could see the panic in her eyes as she collapsed to the floor. In an instant, the joyous celebration turned into chaos. Thomas rushed to Morgana's side, holding her in his arms and screaming her name. He could feel her fading away, slipping from his grasp. Morgana's last words were a whisper, barely audible above the commotion. "I love you, Thomas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Always and forever." And then she was gone. Thomas was inconsolable. He retreated to his mansion, shutting himself off from the world. For weeks he cried and mourned, reliving every moment he had ever spent with Morgana. But as time passed, Thomas realized that he couldn't keep living in the past. He knew that Morgana would want him to keep living his life and finding joy in the world. And so, he picked himself up and moved forward, cherishing the memories of his sweet Morgana and keeping her love close to his heart. Unspoken love, a tribute to Thomas. Thomas had been in love with Jess for as long as he could remember. They had been friends since they were kids, but he always wanted more. He was afraid to tell her, worried that it would ruin their friendship if she didn't feel the same way. Despite his feelings, Thomas tried his best to suppress them and enjoy their time together as friends. He loved being around her, even if it meant he couldn't be with her the way he truly wanted. One summer day, while out on a hike in the mountains, tragedy struck. Thomas stumbled and fell from a steep ledge, suffering severe injuries. He was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was too great, and he passed away that night. Jess was devastated by the news. She had no idea how much Thomas meant to her until he was gone. She had always felt a deep connection with him, but she had never realized just how much she cared for him until it was too late. That night, as she lay in bed, Jess could hear Thomas's voice in her head. She remembered all the times they had spent together, laughing and talking, and she realized just how much he had meant to her. As the tears flowed down her cheeks, Jess screamed out into the night for her loss. She wished she could have told Thomas how much she loved him before it was too late. She wished she could have been with him in his final moments, to hold his hand and tell him that she cared for him too. But it was too late now. Thomas was gone, and all Jess could do was grieve. She vowed to never take the people she loved for granted again, and to always tell them how she felt. She didn't want to live with regret like she did now. As the days passed, Jess slowly began to heal. She knew that Thomas would want her to be happy, and so she did her best to honor his memory. She never forgot the lessons he taught her about love and friendship, and she carried those with her always. The Last Light of Kenneth Lonliman by Thomas Miller. In the dim glow of a single flickering bulb, the old farmhouse stood silent against the backdrop of a winter's night. The wind howled through the barren trees, rattling the windows like an intruder seeking entry. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and the echoes of memories long past. Kenneth Lonliman sat alone at the kitchen table, a glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. He was a man weathered by time and sorrow, his once strong frame now bent with the weight of years and regrets. The creases in his face told a story of a life lived on the edge of hope, now teetering on the brink of despair. The gun lay before him, its cold metal surface catching the light, gleaming like a dark promise. It was an old revolver, handed down from his father, who had used it to protect the family farm from predators. Now it served a different purpose, a silent companion in Kenneth's final hours. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the whiskey, feeling the burn as it travelled down his throat, warming him momentarily. But there was no warmth in his heart, only a cold, numbing emptiness. The loneliness had crept in over the years, growing like a shadow that no light could dispel. Kenneth had always been a solitary man, content in his own company, or so he thought. But the years had taken their toll. Friends had drifted away, one by one, leaving him to navigate the long days and even longer nights alone. The farm, once a thriving testament to his hard work, had fallen into disrepair. The fields lay barren, the barn roof sagging, and the animals gone. The echoes of life that once filled these walls had faded, leaving only silence in their wake. He reached out and touched the gun, his fingers tracing the worn grip. It was a familiar feeling, yet foreign in its finality. The revolver was more than just a weapon, it was a symbol of the power he still had, the power to choose, to end the suffering that had become his existence. The decision weighed heavily on him, a burden he had carried for weeks, maybe months, ever since the darkness had begun to consume him. There was no one left to stop him, no voice to call out his name and pull him back from the edge. The world outside had moved on, oblivious to the quiet life that was slipping away in this forgotten corner of the earth. He thought of his wife, Martha, who had passed on years ago, leaving a void that no amount of time could fill. She had been the light in his life, the reason he had endured the hardships, the one who had made this old house feel like a home. Without her, the walls had closed in, the rooms growing colder and emptier with each passing day. Kenneth closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. He could see her face, smiling at him as she tended to the garden, her laughter echoing in the summer air. He could feel the warmth of her hand in his, the way she had held on to him, even in her final moments, as if she knew he would be lost without her. But now, the memories were just ghosts, haunting him, reminding him of what he had lost. The pain was too much to bear, the silence too oppressive. There was no more reason to keep going, no more light to guide him through the darkness. With a deep, shuddering breath, Kenneth picked up the revolver, its weight solid and reassuring in his hand. He placed the barrel against his temple, feeling the cold metal press into his skin. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a profound sense of relief. The end was near, and with it, the end of the pain, the loneliness, the endless nights spent staring into the abyss. He squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear slipping down his weathered cheek. In that moment, he whispered her name, Martha, as if she could hear him, as if she could still reach out and save him from himself. And then, with a final breath, Kenneth Lonliman pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed through the empty house, a brief, violent interruption to the quiet that had settled in like a shroud. The wind outside howled in response, rattling the windows one last time before falling silent. The light in the kitchen flickered once more, then went out, leaving the farmhouse in darkness as the last light of Kenneth Lonlyman's life faded away. Echoes of the Future by Thomas Miller. In the not-so-distant future, the world found itself hurtling towards an unimaginable abyss. The global economy, once carefully guided by the hands of policymakers and financial experts, had now morphed into a runaway train with there were no longer any controlling mechanisms or institutions to stabilize the markets, and chaos reigned supreme. It all started with a series of unprecedented events, a cascade of financial meltdowns, political upheavals, and environmental disasters that unfolded like a domino effect. Governments, once powerful entities that held the strings of their nation's destinies, were reduced to mere spectators, unable to comprehend or control the chaos that ensued. The people, once accustomed to the comforts of modern life, now found themselves on the precipice of an uncertain future. The global village was crumbling, and the once interconnected web of trade and communication had disintegrated into pockets of isolation. Panic and desperation gripped communities as they struggled to adapt to a new reality where the very foundations of their existence were under threat. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, various factions emerged, each vying for control in the vacuum left by the collapse of traditional power structures. Border disputes escalated into full-blown conflicts, resources became scarce, and the struggle for survival intensified. The world, once filled with the promise of progress and unity, now teetered on the brink of anarchy. Amidst the chaos, a group of brilliant minds from diverse backgrounds came together in a last-ditch effort to salvage what remained of humanity. They formed an unconventional alliance, pooling their knowledge and expertise to understand the root causes of the global meltdown. As they delved into the intricate web of interconnected crises, they discovered a disturbing truth. A black swan event, an unpredictable and catastrophic occurrence that had set off the irreversible chain reaction. The realization that there was no easy fix, no magic solution to reset the world's course, sent shockwaves through the group. The runaway train was speeding towards a chasm, and the brakes were nowhere to be found. The once stable societies were unraveling, and the fabric of civilization was tearing apart at the seams. As the Black Swan event unfolded with relentless force, the group faced a daunting choice: to succumb to the impending doom or to forge a new path forward. They knew that they couldn't turn back time or undo the damage. Instead, they focused on building bridges between the fractured remnants of humanity, fostering cooperation and understanding in the face of adversity. In the midst of the chaos, a spark of resilience ignited. People began to recognize the futility of conflict and the necessity of unity. Slowly but steadily, communities started to rebuild, not in the image of the past, but with a newfound wisdom born from the ashes of a once great civilization. The world had changed irreversibly, and life, as they once knew it, was gone. Yet, in the face of unprecedented challenges, humanity found the strength to adapt, evolve, and create a new narrative for the future. The runaway train may have derailed, but from the wreckage emerged a glimmer of hope, a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human race. The group of brilliant minds, now known as the Catalysts, became beacons of guidance in this shattered world. Their alliance, born out of necessity, evolved into a symbol of hope and a source of inspiration for those seeking a way forward. They embarked on a mission to share knowledge, foster collaboration, and ignite the embers of innovation in the hearts of those willing to listen. One of the Catalysts, Dr. Amelia Foster, a renowned environmental scientist, dedicated herself to understanding the ecological consequences of the Black Swan event. She collaborated with engineers, inventors, and local communities to develop sustainable technologies that could mitigate the damage inflicted on the planet. Together, they devised methods to harness renewable energy, purify contaminated water sources, and restore ravaged ecosystems. Meanwhile, Alexei Volkov, an economist with a keen understanding of the intricacies of global finance, worked tirelessly to create alternative economic models. He believed that the old system, which had led to the collapse, needed to be replaced with a more equitable and resilient framework. Localized, community-driven economies began to emerge, fostering self-sufficiency and reducing dependence on a fragile global market. The catalysts also included social leaders, artists, and communicators who recognized the power of storytelling in shaping the narrative of this new world. They collaborated to weave a tapestry of shared values, emphasizing the importance of compassion, cooperation, and sustainability. Through art, music, and communal gatherings, they nurtured a sense of unity that transcended the borders that once divided nations. As the catalyst's influence spread, communities around the world started adopting their principles. Grassroots movements, once driven by desperation, became agents of positive change. The remnants of the old world were repurposed, and the scars of the Black Swan event became reminders of humanity's capacity for resilience and transformation. Despite the ongoing challenges, a semblance of order emerged from the chaos. The world was no longer a runaway train spiraling towards destruction. It was a mosaic of diverse communities, each contributing to the collective effort of rebuilding. People learned to value simplicity over excess, cooperation over competition, and sustainability over exploitation. In the wake of the Black Swan event, a new era dawned. A chapter of human history that emphasized collaboration, adaptability, and a shared responsibility for the planet. The catalysts, once faced with an insurmountable challenge, had sparked a global renaissance, proving that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit could find a way to thrive. Life as it was once known might be gone, but from its ashes emerged a world sculpted by resilience, innovation, and the unwavering belief in the potential for a brighter tomorrow. The catalyst's vision extended beyond the immediate challenges of survival. They recognized the need for a collective memory that would anchor humanity in the lessons learned from the past. Together, they initiated a global project to archive the knowledge, stories, and experiences of diverse communities during the tumultuous times. This digital repository, known as the Chronicles of Resilience, became a testament to the strength of the human spirit and a guide for future generations. As the world gradually stabilized, the catalysts transitioned from crisis management to fostering long-term sustainability. They worked with communities to establish education programs that emphasized critical thinking, innovation, and ecological responsibility. The concept of citizenship evolved to include a shared commitment to stewardship of the planet and mutual support. Amidst the rebuilding efforts, a network of interconnected communities emerged, each contributing its unique strengths to the collective whole. Local governance structures prioritized inclusivity and transparency, ensuring that decisions were made with the well-being of all community members in mind. The once lost sense of interconnectedness found new life in the form of these collaborative technology, once a double-edged sword that had contributed to the collapse, was repurposed as a tool for sustainable development. Innovation hubs, fueled by the combined expertise of scientists, engineers, and advances in green technology, regenerative agriculture, and decentralized energy production became cornerstones of this renaissance. Over time, the Chronicles of Resilience evolved into a dynamic, living record, a platform for ongoing dialogue and exchange of ideas among communities worldwide. The stories contained within its digital pages served as a reminder of the fragility of the old world and the tenacity required to build a new one. As the years passed, the scars of the Black Swan event faded, replaced by thriving ecosystems and vibrant communities. The world that emerged from the brink of collapse was not a perfect utopia, but a resilient tapestry woven from the threads of shared hardships and collective triumphs. The catalysts, now elders guiding the next generation, observed with pride as humanity navigated the challenges of the new era. They had sparked a transformation that transcended the immediate crisis, laying the groundwork for a future where the mistakes of the past were not forgotten but used as stepping stones toward a more sustainable and harmonious existence. In the end, life as humanity once knew it was indeed gone, but from its ashes arose a world reborn, a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who dared to dream of a better tomorrow. In the years that followed the establishment of the New World, the spirit of collaboration continued to thrive. The Catalysts, now revered as founders of a new era, remained guardians of the guiding principles that had emerged from the ashes of the old world. Their wisdom became a beacon for leaders, and their stories were passed down through generations as a reminder of the resilience embedded in the human DNA. The once scattered communities had grown into interconnected hubs of innovation, culture, and sustainable living. Trade routes that had once been conduits of conflict now facilitated the exchange of knowledge, resources, and cultural practices. A sense of global citizenship emerged, transcending geographical boundaries and fostering a shared responsibility for the well-being of the entire planet. The Chronicles of Resilience continued to evolve, transforming into an immersive educational platform that utilized emerging technologies. Virtual reality experiences allowed individuals to step into the shoes of those who had faced the challenges head-on, fostering empathy and understanding across diverse cultures. The lessons of the past were not just read but lived, creating a profound impact on the collective consciousness. Education became a cornerstone of the new society, emphasizing not just academic knowledge, but also practical skills and emotional intelligence. Schools, once focused solely on individual success, now prioritized community, collaboration, and environmental stewardship. The youth, armed with a holistic education, became ambassadors of positive change, leading initiatives for sustainability, social justice, and the concept of governance underwent a radical transformation. Decisions were made through participatory processes that involved input from all members of the community. Technology facilitated direct democracy, ensuring that the diverse voices within a community were heard and valued. Leaders emerged not through power struggles, but by embodying the values of empathy, collaboration. Renewable energy sources became the primary engine driving the world forward. Cities transformed into green oases with vertical gardens, sustainable architecture, and clean energy infrastructure. The scars on the environment were gradually healed as reforestation projects and ecological restoration efforts flourished, turning once barren landscapes into thriving ecosystems. Art and culture, once considered luxuries, became integral to the fabric of society. Creativity was celebrated as a driving force behind innovation and societal progress. Museums, theatres, and cultural exchange programs flourished, fostering a global appreciation for the richness of human expression and diversity. Through a combination of technological advancements and the lessons learned from the Chronicles of Resilience, humanity had not just survived but had evolved into a species that cherished its interconnectedness with each other and the planet. The once looming spectre of irreversible collapse had been replaced by a shared commitment to building a sustainable and harmonious future. As the Catalysts approached the end of their journey, they marveled at the world they had helped shape. The train that had once careened towards destruction was now a symbol of transformation, a testament to the capacity of humanity to overcome even the most daunting challenges. In the quiet moments of reflection, the Catalysts found solace in knowing that they had played a crucial role in turning the tide. The legacy they left behind was not just a set of principles etched in history books. It was a living, breathing reality embraced by a global community that had learned to dance on the precipice of chaos and emerge stronger on the other side. And so, the world continued to turn, not on the axis of fear and uncertainty, but on the pivot of resilience, innovation, and a shared vision for a future that honored the delicate balance between humanity and the world it called home. The years stretched on, and the world continued to evolve in ways that would have seemed unimaginable during the dark days of the Black Swan event. The principles laid down by the Catalysts guided the trajectory of human civilization, but challenges persisted. Yet, with each obstacle, humanity drew upon the lessons of the past, demonstrating an uncanny ability to adapt and thrive in the face of adversity. One of the ongoing challenges was the need for sustainable resource management. As the global population grew, careful stewardship of the planet became even more critical. The catalysts, recognizing the delicate balance between human needs and the environment, championed initiatives to further advance regenerative agriculture, circular economies, and responsible resource extraction. Dr. Amelia Foster, the environmental scientist among the catalysts, became a leading figure in the ongoing efforts to restore ecosystems and combat climate change. Through collaborations with communities and scientists worldwide, she spearheaded projects to rewild regions that had suffered ecological degradation. Afforestation efforts transformed barren lands into lush, biodiverse havens, capturing carbon and revitalizing ecosystems. The catalysts had understood that technology, when wielded responsibly, could be a powerful force for good. Innovations in artificial intelligence were leveraged to optimize resource allocation, predict environmental changes, and enhance disaster preparedness. Clean energy technologies continued to advance, making renewable sources more accessible and efficient, and contributing to a global shift away from fossil fuels. As communities became increasingly connected through technology, the catalysts faced the challenge of preserving the essence of local cultures. They emphasized the importance of diversity as a source of strength and creativity, encouraging the development of digital platforms that facilitated cross-cultural exchanges while respecting the uniqueness of each community's identity. The Chronicles of Resilience had evolved into a comprehensive digital repository, constantly updated with new stories, innovations, and insights from around the world. It had become a living testament to the ongoing journey of humanity, a dynamic archive that inspired future generations to learn from the past and contribute to the collective wisdom of the species. Education remained a cornerstone of societal progress. The catalysts had envisioned a system that nurtured critical thinking, creativity, and adaptability. Schools had transformed into vibrant centers of learning, with interdisciplinary curricula that prepared students not just for careers, but for life as engaged and responsible global citizens. Alexei Volkov's economic models had withstood the test of time, providing a framework for equitable and sustainable economic systems. Localized economies thrived, supported by decentralized networks of production and consumption. The emphasis on well-being over perpetual growth had created societies where happiness and fulfillment were prioritized over material accumulation. Social structures had undergone a profound shift. Gender equality, long championed by the catalysts, became a fundamental principle embedded in the fabric of society. Inclusive governance structures ensured that decision-making processes were representative of the diverse perspectives within communities. Empathy and cooperation were valued as essential qualities for leaders in all spheres of life. The once scattered communities had become interconnected in ways that transcended geographical borders. Virtual reality technologies allowed individuals to participate in global conferences, cultural events, and collaborative projects without leaving their homes. The world had become a tapestry of shared experiences, bound together by a common understanding of the interconnectedness of all life. Art and culture flourished as never before. Artists were revered as visionaries, interpreting the human experience in ways that resonated across cultures. Public spaces were adorned with murals, sculptures, and installations that celebrated the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. The creative expression of humanity became a universal language that transcended linguistic and cultural barriers. In the midst of this ongoing transformation, the catalysts, now elders, continued to play a pivotal role in guiding humanity. They had become revered figures, not as saviors, but as mentors who offered wisdom and perspective to a world that had learned to navigate its own course. The catalysts' retreats, where they shared insights and engaged in dialogue with emerging leaders, became highly anticipated events that fostered continuity in the guiding principles of the new world. Yet, challenges persisted. The ever-expanding frontiers of exploration and knowledge revealed new complexities that required innovative solutions. The catalysts understood that the journey of human evolution was ongoing, and the resilience of the species lay in its ability to adapt, learn, and remain humble in the face of the unknown. One of the persistent challenges was the ethical use of emerging technologies. As artificial intelligence and biotechnology continued to advance, questions arose about the ethical boundaries of scientific exploration. The catalysts convened global dialogues to establish ethical frameworks that guided the responsible development and deployment of technologies, ensuring that humanity's progress remained aligned with its values. The ongoing quest for understanding the universe led to advancements in space exploration. Human colonies were established on the Moon and Mars, expanding the reach of civilization beyond Earth. The catalysts who had once grappled with the challenges of averting a global catastrophe now faced the complexities of managing humanity's presence in the cosmos. As humanity ventured into the unknown, the catalysts emphasized the importance of preserving the integrity of celestial bodies. International agreements were forged to ensure sustainable practices in space exploration, preventing the unintended consequences that had befell Earth. The lessons learned from the Black Swan event served as a guiding beacon, reminding humanity to approach the cosmos with humility and respect. The bonds forged among communities on Earth extended into space. Collaborative efforts in scientific research, resource utilization, and cultural exchange transcended planetary boundaries. The once divided world had become a united civilization, navigating the vast expanse of the cosmos with a shared sense of purpose and interconnectedness. In the midst of these cosmic explorations, a new generation of leaders emerged. The catalysts, now in their twilight years, witnessed the torch being passed to a new cohort of visionaries. The principles that had guided humanity through the aftermath of the Black Swan event were not static dogmas, but living values that adapted to the evolving needs of the species. The Chronicles of Resilience, now a multi-dimensional platform that integrated virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and collective intelligence, continued to be a repository of knowledge, a catalyst for innovation, and a beacon of inspiration. It had become a virtual realm where individuals could explore the depths of human experience, learn from the wisdom of the past, and contribute to the ongoing narrative of resilience and evolution. As the catalysts passed into legend, their influence endured through the generations. Statues and monuments commemorated their contributions, not as idols, but as reminders of a pivotal moment in human history. The principles they had championed, resilience, cooperation, sustainability, and the pursuit of knowledge, remained at the core of a thriving civilization that had learned to navigate the complexities of the 21st century and beyond. And so, the story continued, a story not bound by the limitations of a single narrative, but an ever-evolving epic written by the collective efforts of countless individuals across time and space. The Black Swan event, once a harbinger of doom, had become a catalyst for transformation, propelling humanity into a future where the possibilities were as vast as the cosmos itself. As the world turned and the tapestry of human experience continued to be woven, one truth remained evident. Life, in all its complexity and beauty, was a journey, one that unfolded with each step taken, each challenge. The echoes of the past resonated in the present, guiding humanity towards a future where the indomitable spirit of resilience and the quest for a better world persisted, unyielding and eternal. The arrival of Ale Chopia by Thomas Miller. Ale Chopia arrived in the small town of Flora, Florida, months before, a man hardened by the bitter streets of Ireland, with a strange calmness that could not be attributed to his gruff appearance. He trudged along the dirt and dust path, a workman's bag slung over his shoulder, his head down and his face hidden from the sun. Nobody paid him heed, and although he wasn't suspicious of anyone, Ale Chopia remained on the lookout for trouble. He had been travelling for weeks and his money was running low, so when he reached the edge of the town, he followed a bend in the road that he'd heard about from a man he had shared a meal with a few days before. He wanted to find a place to stay, a place where he could find a job and make a living. The path meandered through a few blocks of low-lying buildings and storefronts, the dirt roads full of cracks, before finally coming to a small house tucked away in a corner of the town square. Al Chopya's heart beat wildly as he approached the door of the house and knocked. He was welcomed with open arms by a large woman wearing a broad smile, who introduced herself as Mrs. Weber, the owner of the house. She had been expecting him, and she had a job for him as a butcher in her family's small store. Al Chopya welcomed the offer with open arms and was soon spending his days cutting and portioning meats for the townsfolk. Although the people of Flora were friendly and kind, they eyed Al Chopya with suspicion when he went around town. He knew they were suspicious of his past, and although he never revealed his true identity, he did wear a sword at his waist. This was enough to make the townsfolk wary of the new butcher and to keep their distance. In the months that followed, Al Chopya earned the trust of his employer, Mrs. Weber, and the people of Flora. He was diligent in his work, and his prices were fair for the quality of the meats he cut. He also found a friend in Weber's son, Tom, who was often there to help him in the store. But beneath the smiles and suave demeanour of Al Chopya, there lurked a dark side. For beneath his friendly exterior lurked a man with a passion for butchering. He loved the smell of fresh meat, the feel of the blade in his hands, and the rush of power that came with taking a life. He had discovered this passion by accident when, as a child in Ireland, he had killed his own mother in a fit of rage. Since then, he had used his knife to take the lives of countless women, usually those who were crippled or disabled in some fashion. He found them easy to catch, and they never put up a fight.
The Town That Once Was, The Fall of Mortionville, by Thomas Miller. Chapter 1, A Picture-Perfect Beginning. Mortionville, Texas. If you had asked anyone from the town what it was like, they'd tell you it was the closest thing to heaven on earth. Tucked away in the southernmost part of the state, Mortionville sat peacefully right on the border with Mexico. It was a place where the sun seemed to shine a little brighter, the air was sweeter, and the people were kinder than anywhere else. Everyone knew each other, from the oldest resident, Ms. McCracken, to the youngest kid in the local elementary school. There were no strangers in Mortionville, just neighbors you hadn't yet met. The town had grown up around its main street, a line of low, weathered buildings housing everything the town needed: a diner, a post office, a general store, a school, and the church. On any given day, you could find people gathered in the diner, sipping on coffee, sharing gossip, and laughing over plates of apple pie. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And, most importantly, it was home. What made Mortionville special wasn't its size or its location, it was its people. This was a town where families had lived for generations, passing down homes and businesses like heirlooms. The spirit of the place was rooted in unity, in the understanding that everyone in Mortionville was responsible for one another. Disagreements were settled over a handshake and a beer, and the town itself felt like one big family reunion that never ended. Though it was small, the town had an undeniable charm. The red, white, and blue flag of the United States fluttered proudly on every porch, a reminder of the shared values that held the community together. Patriotism ran deep in Mortionville, as did faith and loyalty to one another. You'd be hard-pressed to find a person in the town who hadn't served in the military or whose parents or grandparents hadn't contributed to the community in some way. It was a town that knew the meaning of sacrifice and the importance of standing together. Yet, despite its closeness to the Mexican border, the troubles that plagued larger towns or cities seemed a world away. In fact, for years, Mortionville had gone untouched by the issues of immigration or border security. While other border towns were wrestling with an influx of people crossing into the United States, Mortionville remained isolated from the conflict. The U.S. Border Patrol made their occasional rounds, but for the most part, they left Mortionville alone. The town had a reputation for being safe, tight-knit, and completely self-sufficient. What no one in Mortionville could have predicted, though, was how that isolation would eventually work against them. As time went on, the U.S. government gradually pulled back its resources from smaller towns like Mawsonville. With more focus on larger cities with higher crossing rates, the Border Patrol became less and less visible. But that didn't matter much to the people of Mawsonville. They believed their quiet corner of Texas would remain untouched. And in a way, it did. Because, in Mawsonville, the border wasn't just a line drawn between two countries. It was the edge of a world that had nothing to do with them. The people who crossed the border, families looking for a better life or travelers passing through, were rarely a threat. The townspeople helped when they could, offering food or water to those in need, but for the most part, they kept to themselves. Mawsonville didn't see outsiders as problems. It saw them as people, just like them. Still, to protect their small slice of paradise, a group of 6 men, all local to the town, took it upon themselves to monitor the borders unofficially. The leader, Tom Wallace, had lived in Mawsonville his entire life. A former Marine, he brought discipline and a sense of duty to the informal group of volunteers. The others, Mike Tanner, the Mitchell brothers, John Morris, and Dan Russo, were all ordinary men with a deep love for their town. They had families to protect, lives they valued. And if no one else was going to keep an eye on things, then they would. After all, it was their town, and it was worth protecting. Their work was never glamorous, nor did it come with any pay. They kept watch on the outskirts of the town, occasionally guiding lost travelers back toward safer paths or warning them away when necessary. In the beginning, it felt like a community service, something they did out of pride and responsibility. It was hardly ever dangerous. In fact, the biggest problems they faced were the scorching summer heat and the wild animals that roamed the desert at night. But over the years, the group grew older. And while their spirit remained strong, their bodies did not. There was no one stepping up to replace them, no younger generation willing to take on the mantle of protecting the town. People didn't think it was necessary. Why bother when the town had always been safe? Why worry when Mawsonville had never seen any real trouble? No one realized how vulnerable they had become. For years, Mawsonville had been the perfect American small town. But perfection, as everyone would soon learn, is often the calm before the storm. And the storm was coming. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting a warm golden light over the town, the people of Mawsonville went about their lives, unaware that their peaceful days were numbered. They didn't yet know that the safety they had always relied on would soon be shattered. What had once been a symbol of unity and protection, their beloved town, would become a battleground. Chapter 2: The Self-Appointed Guardians. The 6 men who took it upon themselves to watch over Mawsonville were the town's unspoken defenders. Tom Wallace was their leader, not because he wanted to be, but because no one else could do the job quite like him. His time as a Marine had shaped him into the perfect mix of discipline and stubbornness, and though his hair had grayed and his knees had started to ache, his resolve had never wavered. Tom wasn't just watching the border, he was watching over his home, his family, and everything he held dear. The others followed his lead, each bringing their own skills to the table. Mike Tanner, despite his age, still had the sharpest eyes in the group. He could spot movement in the distance long before anyone else, though his limp from an old war wound made his patrols slower these days. The Mitchell brothers, Frank and Harry, were the muscle. Burly and tough, they ran the local hardware store and were always the first to show up when something needed fixing or someone needed help. John Morris, the town schoolteacher, wasn't a fighter by nature, but his sense of duty to his students and their families made him a loyal part of the group. And then there was Dan Russo, the town mechanic, who kept their trucks running and made sure the group had everything they needed to keep Mawsonville secure. The 6 men had taken on the responsibility of watching the border years ago, when the government began pulling back on resources. It hadn't been a sudden shift, but a gradual one. Patrols became less frequent, and the federal government's attention drifted to larger towns and cities. No one was going to look out for Mawsonville except the people who lived there, and these 6 men decided they would be the ones to do it. At first, it had been almost too easy. The men would meet up at the diner in the morning, sharing a cup of coffee before heading out to patrol the stretches of desert that bordered the town. They weren't law enforcement, and they didn't pretend to be. Their job wasn't to arrest anyone, just to keep an eye on things and make sure the town stayed safe. Most of the people who crossed the border were families, desperate for a better life, and the men did their best to help when they could. Water, food, a point in the right direction, it was the least they could do. But they had rules. No one crossed into Mortionville without their knowledge, and no one stayed long. The town was too small, too fragile, to support an influx of strangers. The men were polite but firm. Mortionville was not a place for outsiders. Over the years, the patrols became more routine, and the 6 men grew comfortable in their role. They knew the land like the back of their hands. Every hill, every wash, every trail. It was their territory, and they believed they had it under control. Yet, as time passed, their numbers began to dwindle, not because of any outside threat, but because of time itself. The men were getting older, slower. Tom Wallace's knees ached more with every patrol, and Mike Tanner's eyesight wasn't what it used to be. Frank Mitchell had been talking about retirement for years, and his brother Harry had already started spending more time fishing than working. John Morris had taken on extra hours at the school, leaving less time for patrols, and Dan Russo had more business than ever at his garage, with no time for late-night watches in the desert. The younger men of Mortionville showed no interest in taking up the mantle. Why would they? The town was peaceful, and the border patrol still showed up once in a while. It seemed unnecessary to spend your time patrolling the outskirts when nothing ever happened. But complacency is a dangerous thing. One hot afternoon, Tom sat on his porch, gazing out at the wide-open expanse of desert beyond the town. The air shimmered with heat, and a few vultures circled lazily overhead, searching for their next meal. Tom's gut told him something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It was the kind of feeling he used to get before a mission, back when he was stationed overseas. That quiet, gnawing sense of unease that told him trouble was coming, even when everything looked fine on the surface. He wasn't alone in his worry. Mike Tanner had mentioned it to him just the other day. "Something's different," Mike had said, leaning on his cane as they stood in the shade by the diner. "I don't know what it is, but I can feel it in my bones." Tom had nodded, but he hadn't known what to say. What could they do? They were just 6 old men trying to hold on to something they had no control over. The border patrol hadn't been through in weeks, and the number of people crossing seemed to have increased. Not families, this time, men. Groups of them. Some armed. They didn't linger, and they didn't talk, but their presence sent a clear message. Things were changing. "We should tell the sheriff," John Morris had suggested one evening after patrol, his brow furrowed with worry. But Tom had waved him off. The sheriff's got enough on his plate. Besides, what's he going to do? Send out a couple of deputies to patrol with us? It's not like we've got an army here. John had fallen silent after that, but the look of concern never left his face. The others had felt it too. The feeling that something was slipping away from them, that the control they once had over their small piece of the world was eroding. Then one day, Mike Tanner didn't come back from his patrol. The sun was setting by the time Tom realized Mike was late. He should have been back hours ago. Tom gathered the others, John, Dan, the Mitchell brothers, and they set out in their trucks, searching the dusty trails that crisscrossed the desert. They found Mike's truck near the old crossing point, doors wide open, keys still in the ignition. But of Mike himself, there was no sign. The men searched through the night, but it was as if Mike had vanished into thin air. His disappearance sent a ripple of fear through the town. People whispered that maybe he had gotten lost, maybe he had wandered too far in the heat. But Tom and the others knew better. Mike hadn't gotten lost. Something, or someone, had taken him. For the first time in their lives, the men of Mortionville realized that they weren't just playing at being protectors anymore. The threat they had always feared was real. And it had come for one of their own. Tom sat alone on his porch later that night, the weight of Mike's disappearance heavy on his heart. The desert, once so familiar and welcoming, now felt hostile and foreign. The uneasy feeling in his gut had grown into a deep, cold dread. Something was coming for Mortionville. And it wasn't going to stop until it had taken everything. Chapter 3. The cartel arrives. The disappearance of Mike Tanner sent shockwaves through Mortionville. In a town where nothing ever happened, something like this was unthinkable. Families locked their doors at night, a habit they hadn't practiced in years. The usual friendly conversations at the diner grew tense, whispers circulating among the townsfolk. Rumors flew, but no one really knew what to believe. Some said Mike had wandered into cartel territory. Others speculated he'd been taken, though by whom no one could say for sure. But everyone agreed on one thing: things were changing in Mortionville. The sense of peace that had always blanketed the town had been shattered, and no one knew how to piece it back together. Tom Wallace and the others didn't give up on finding Mike. They searched every inch of the desert around the town for days, calling in every favor they could from nearby towns and local authorities. But the sheriff's department was stretched thin, and the government's priorities were far from the border town of Mortionville. There was no help coming. As the days passed, the men were forced to accept the reality they didn't want to face: Mike wasn't coming back. What had happened to him was no accident. Someone had taken him, and the cartel was the most likely culprit. The men had heard whispers for years about cartel activity just across the border, but it had never seemed like something they had to worry about. Mortionville had always been too small, too insignificant for anyone to bother with. But that had changed. And soon, the town would learn just how wrong they had been. The first sign that the cartel had its eye on Mortionville came not long after Mike's disappearance. A group of strangers rolled into town one afternoon, their trucks kicking up clouds of dust as they parked along the deserted main street. The men who stepped out weren't like the travelers who had passed through before. These men were hardened, muscular, tattooed, and armed. They wore sunglasses even though the sun had started to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town. Their presence was like a dark cloud, heavy and suffocating. Tom and the remaining guardians watched from the diner, where they had gathered to talk strategy. Tom's instincts told him to act, but they were outnumbered, and there was no backup in sight. He knew better than to rush into a confrontation unprepared, but his gut twisted as he watched the men stroll down the street like they owned the place. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, walked into the diner without so much as a knock. The chatter inside fell to a hush, every eye on the strangers as they entered. Tom stood up slowly, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his pistol, hidden under the table. He met the leader's gaze, trying to read the man's intentions. "You in charge here?" the man asked, his voice smooth but carrying a dangerous edge. Tom squared his shoulders. "Something like that." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. That'll make this easier." Tom's hand tightened on his pistol, though he didn't draw it. "And what exactly is this?" The man's smile faded. "We're here to let you know that this town, Mortionville, right, is under new management. My boss has plans for this place, and we don't want any trouble. But if you or anyone else tries to get in the way, well," he glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the other patrons, "it won't end well for you." Tom's jaw clenched. "What plans?" The man shrugged. "Doesn't matter to you. Just know that starting now, this town is ours. And if you want to stay alive, you'll keep your heads down and your mouths shut." The air in the diner seemed to thicken with tension. Tom's mind raced as he considered his options. He could shoot the man right then and there, start a fight he knew he couldn't win. Or he could let the cartel move in, let them take over without a word. But neither option sat right with him. Tom had spent his whole life fighting for the things he believed in. Mortionville was his home, his family's home, and he wasn't about to let some outsider come in and take that away. But he also knew that going up against the cartel without backup was suicide. "We don't want trouble," Tom said finally, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "But this is our town. You don't get to just walk in here and take it." The man chuckled, but it was a cold, humorless sound. "You'll learn soon enough, old man. There's no stopping what's coming. Mortionville's ours now." With that, he turned on his heel and walked out, the rest of his men following him without another word. The door swung shut behind them, and the diner was left in an eerie silence. Tom stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, his mind racing. This was it. The fight they had always feared but never expected had arrived. The cartel wanted Mortionville, and they weren't going to take no for an answer. That night, Tom called the other guardians together at his home. They sat around his worn kitchen table, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on all of them. The Mitchell brothers looked grim, their faces set in hard lines. John Morris stared at the table, his hands clenched into fists, while Dan Russo rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion clear in his eyes. "We can't just let them take over," John said, his voice low but firm. "This is our town. And what are we supposed to do about it?" Dan shot back, frustration lacing his words. "There's 6 of us, and we're not exactly in our prime. They've got guns, they've got numbers, and they've got no problem killing anyone who stands in their way. We're outmatched." Tom listened to the arguments in silence, his mind turning over the situation. Dan was right. They were outmatched, and if they fought, they'd likely lose. But John was right too. This was their town, and letting the cartel take it without a fight went against everything they stood for. "We need help," Tom said finally. "We can't do this on our own. We've got to get word out to someone who can do something." "Like who?" Frank Mitchell asked. "The sheriff's already stretched thin, and the government doesn't give a damn about us. We're just a dot on the map to them." Tom shook his head. "There's got to be someone. We'll start making calls. Maybe we can get the feds involved, or the state. Someone will listen." But even as he said it, Tom knew how unlikely it was. They were on their own, and deep down, he knew the odds weren't in their favor. Over the next few weeks, the cartel's presence in Mortionville grew. They moved in quietly at first, setting up shop on the outskirts of town, but it wasn't long before they made their intentions clear. Businesses were threatened, people were intimidated, and the once peaceful streets of Mortionville began to feel like a battleground. The 6 men tried to hold the line, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. The cartel was too strong, too well organized, and they had no qualms about using violence to get what they wanted. What the men didn't realize was that the worst was yet to come. The cartel wasn't just after Mortionville. They wanted to turn the town into a hub for their smuggling operations, a safe base where they could funnel drugs, weapons, and people across the border without interference. And the people of Mortionville, the good, honest people who had built their lives in that town, were nothing more than collateral damage. The fight for Mortionville had only just begun. And it wasn't going to end without blood. Chapter 4, A Slow Descent into Chaos. Mortionville wasn't the same town it had been just a few months ago. The once vibrant Main Street, filled with laughter and neighborly chats, had turned into a shadow of its former self. The town's heart, the diner where everyone gathered for coffee and conversation, was now a place of whispered fears and hushed voices. People had started avoiding eye contact, keeping their heads down as they went about their business. The unwritten rule of Mortionville, everyone looks out for each other, was slowly unraveling. The cartel was tightening its grip. At first, it was subtle. A few unfamiliar faces standing around the edges of town, watching. Then, it grew more obvious. Businesses were visited by men with cold eyes and promises that everything would be fine as long as they cooperated.